All right. Hope you had a nice lunch. My name is Matt Prewitt. I'm president of RadicalxChange Foundation, and I'm going to give a short talk about plurality and how it relates to certain kinds of big picture political questions, and then ground that into some of the work that I've done recently on community currencies and sort of thinking about different systems of money. So I want to start with the idea that plurality implies its opposite, right? So when we talk about plurality, implicitly there's some sort of opposite principle that we have in mind, which might be some sort of totalizing principle that organizes everything, or totalitarianism, some kind of lack of diversity, or authoritarianism. But when we start to think about these two things, like plurality on the one hand and singularity on the other, it gets into really, really tricky conceptual territory. And I want to get into that a little bit and point towards a conception of plurality that I think helps us structure some of the toughest sort of moral and political questions that are out there in terms of relating to basically the legitimacy of power and the boundaries of community, and then connect that to some concrete thinking about new institutions and in particular money. All right, so I warned you this would be a little bit philosophical. Plato, in the dialogue Parmenides, has all kinds of choice quotes, one of which is, "A one which is a plurality, both one and many, whole and parts, limited as well as indefinitely numerous." So this is a very, very old question. Even before Plato, this was this paradox between the idea of a whole, which is comprised of parts and is therefore both one and many. That paradox was seen as like the fundamental question of being. So this is a very deep, very old question. And if we kind of bring this into the current conversation, we have a couple different sort of archetypes in mind. First, the metaphor of a coral reef has become very popular, and one hears it a lot, especially in conversations about plurality. So you have this idea of an open network of interdependent parts, which is a plurality. And then we can kind of contrast that with the idea of like a single bounded whole or an entity, which has resonance with the idea of a polity or a community or an authority. But in many ways, these two ideas are connected. And so like, the authoritarian thinker Thomas Hobbes in the cover of his famous book Leviathan, he depicts the idea of an authority as like a composite of all of the different human citizens or members of the polity. But this duality is quite sort of complicated, right? Because if we take the idea of a coral reef and if we zoom in on it a little bit, you'll find a fish, right? And if you look at a fish, a fish for all the world kind of looks like a leviathan or like the dictator of its cells, sort of a composite of all of its cells. And if we keep zooming in, we'll find another plurality, right? We'll find a network of interdependent parts, which are the organs within the fish, right? If we keep zooming in, we'll find another sort of unity, right? We'll find a cell. And if we keep going, we'll find that the cell is also this network of interdependent parts. We can kind of play this game forever. You could play that down to the sort of subatomic level, and you can also zoom up, right? You can think of if you go up above the level of the fish and the coral reef, you'll find this sort of alternating series of perspectives on what's going on, right? Above the coral reef, you'll find the entity of the earth. Above that, you'll find the interdependent network of celestial bodies. You keep zooming out, you have a star, right? So there's a way in which these two things are two sides of the same coin. And I think a helpful way of thinking about it is that the sort of singularity or unity is like the external aspect. So when you're looking at things from outside, they appear that way. And when you're kind of within it, you'll see something more like a coral reef, more like an interdependent network of things. And this sort of duality shows up all the time in politics. It's like a really important thing that is constantly being navigated in questions of political morality. It's questions of which entities or wholes matter, how much, and where their boundaries are. So a couple quick examples. If we think about the fish, right? There we sort of make a normative judgment that the fish matters more than its cells, and so there's like you have this process of apoptosis. If a cell is harming the whole of the fish, then we're happy to sacrifice the cell for the good of the fish. And then in all kinds of situations in politics, for example, the whole concept of human rights is that the whole of the nation doesn't absolutely trump the interests of the humans that comprise it, right? So you have situations in which we'll place the whole above the parts. This says Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, which is the first part of the German post-war constitution, says the human dignity is inviolable. And bridging gets into this question all the time, right? Because when we think about bridging, it's like we're often sort of assuming that there's some whole whose integrity we want to sort of preserve. And you can start to imagine sort of sub-communities forming within it. They can strengthen to a point where they sort of threaten the unity of the whole and create conflict. And we are needing to make judgments all the time about, a lot of what Jonathan was getting into this morning is very relevant to this. How do we distinguish between good conflict and bad conflict? And I think there are a few sort of frames, sort of methods for thinking about the relative evaluation of parts and wholes that are instructive. And so I just want to share a little bit about this. So one way of making these kinds of judgments is to postulate a particular whole and say that that matters, and then evaluate everything else by its contribution to that whole. So we could take, like, let's say a nation, France, right? And then we can take all the other things in the world, the big things, the small things, the earth, the other countries, the humans, and evaluate them in terms of their contribution to the whole of France, right? This is basically conservative politics in extremis, right? This is basically sort of friend-enemy politics. It's dividing things along a singular axis in terms of what their contribution to a singular whole is. There's another way of looking at things, which is evaluating everything as parts of like a class of wholes. So we could postulate a class of sort of co-equal wholes and evaluate everything else for each of them and each of them for one another. So here's what I mean by that basically is like you can imagine an array of co-equal humans, right? And then you can look at everything from each of their perspectives. You can evaluate all the other humans from their perspective and all the other things, large and small, in the world from their perspective, from each of their perspectives, and kind of sum that up and say, how are we doing? This is interesting, but I think there's some problems with this sort of procedure too. The main one is, how do we make the valuations from all these different perspectives commensurable? And the way that we normally do that is with money. But there are big problems basically with using monetary systems for affecting this kind of commensurability of values. And the problem is that money itself comes from sort of a single point of view. It has distorting, it distorts the relationship between all of the parts, reduces everything to a single variable. There's all kinds of other issues. Like, for example, the way that it's created is typically by sort of expanding debt, which means that in a way it's servicing like its own growth as opposed to the interests of each of the people that we've decided matters and has interests. And so it unifies everything in a way. Like it connects everything. It sort of resolves the plurality, but it destroys. The way I think about it is it unifies everything, but in sort of a plurality destroying way. So it creates sort of a monoculture that undermines the internal texture of whatever system we're using it in. So there's another way of thinking about this kind of relationship between parts and wholes, which I think is interesting, more interesting and I should say first of all, this one, if the first one is sort of conservatism in extremis, this is sort of like liberalism in extremis, right? Another way of looking at things is to postulate wholes at multiple levels. So we can postulate wholes that we think matter above and below the entity we're evaluating. And then, so if we want to kind of figure out what we think about France, how important are its interests, we can think about it in relation to what's above it and what's below it. So in other words, is it integral to what it's a part of? And is it integrative of what is a part of it? And we can kind of, we might come to different conclusions. We might say it's good for its citizens, but it's bad for, the bigger picture of the earth, which sort of includes the other citizens. And we can kind of, think about all different kinds of institutions or technologies or whatever as sort of interventions between things that we think matter. The idea of plural money, I don't really have enough time to get into it. I just want to sort of gesture towards it, and I'll refer you to some more reading about it. But the idea of plural money is an attempt to design a kind of a paradigm for building community currencies that would allow sort of both of these perspectives to be recognized in an economic system. So that, in other words, instead of just having one variable coming from this sort of perspective of universal money, evaluating everything's contribution to a system, if we could have other sorts of other monetary metrics that are measuring the contribution of wholes or entities to their components from below, or to the things that sort of sit beneath them and comprise them, then we'd be able to sort of, figure out whether our institutions are harming the general ecosystem that they're participating in a much more interesting way than we're able to. But in order to be able to do this, I mean, the classic problem with community currencies has always been basically that people don't want to hold them. It's always preferable to take a community currency and exchange it for the equivalent value in a universal currency at any point in time, because that just gives you more optionality. So in order to create economic structures that would accomplish this, we need to basically build barriers between currency systems. We need to build currency systems in which it is costly to take a currency that's traded within a smaller community and exchange it for something that can be traded within a broader community. And there's all kinds of sort of more technical thoughts that I and others have developed about what that would look like and how to do that. But I don't want to, I'll leave time for at least one or two questions. So the way to think about plurality, in conclusion, I think, is not just to think of it as sort of a network of agents participating with one another horizontally, but also to think of it as an integration of what is below it and what is above it. So I think there's this kind of there's sort of an important insight here as we conceptualize plurality, not to think of it as just an integration between agents operating at the same level, but to think about the sort of internal plurality of our institutions and their sort of their hierarchical texture. All right, there's a link there to read more about plural money, and I will leave it at that.